I realize when bouncing the springs on the steel bench, it makes a punching sound like from a Kurt Russell movie. Well, hello there. Welcome to the shop. So, in my time as a service technician, I get all sorts of jobs across my path. Most are basic oil changes and maintenance procedures. But today, something more interesting has come across my path. This client trusted me with his 2020 Suzuki SV650. He has already fitted a nice-sounding muffler, but now has decided to make a worthwhile investment in his bike. The client reached out to Hyperpro and got himself some new gear rated for his application and weight. Hyperpro is a specialist motorcycle suspension developer from the UK who have a good name to them and have a dealer in Adelaide. Just send them your bike details, rider spec and riding conditions, and they put together the parts. I have been fitting quite a few of their kits now and have had really good feedback from the clients. They provide everything a tech needs. In this case, the client has supplied a rear shock absorber and dual-rate coil springs for the front forks. To access the rear shock, I need to do a bit of disassembly. The fairings around the side of the bike need to go so I can remove the fuel tank. The tank on the SV650 can pivot on the rear fastener. So, I'll remove the front fasteners and prop up the tank. With a supportive plank, I can easily access the wiring and hoses connected to the tank. Only one plug to disconnect the fuel pump and level sender. There are two breather hoses. The first one came off easy, but the second was a little more stubborn. Some needle nose pliers helped out. This rubber hose is still being stubborn. Using a pick to expose the inner hose, I aimed some silicone spray at it, which is all I need to loosen the rubber grip. With the pliers, I just twist the hose a bit to move some of the silicone around, which frees the hose. And finally, with a tiny pry bar, I'm removing the retaining clip so the fuel line can be disconnected. And now I can pull the rear pivoting fastener out and remove the fuel tank. Just get that annoying rubber out of the way. With the tank on, I have the clearance to pull the shock out. There is only one bolt securing the top to the chassis, so that is pretty straightforward. The nut can be accessed from the right side fairly easily. There is plenty of room for the bolt to slide out too. The bottom end of the shock is a little more complicated. There is a linkage system that needs some disassembly to allow the shock to be removed. I'm going to start with that one. I need to support and control the weight of the bike while carrying this out, so I'm using a flat jack with a plank on the exhaust. On a light bike like this, the pipes can support the weight as long as nobody jumps on the bike while working on it. This is the linkage system I was talking about earlier. It's an engineer's cheat code to improve travel geometry of the rear axle. The dog bone bracket on this side is the only thing in the way of the lower bolt coming out, so I'm removing just the right side for now. This first nut came off quite easily, probably because access was easy. I couldn't get a socket secured on the lower nut because the exhaust was in the way. I can get a spanner on there, but getting a good angle to apply some leverage is proving difficult. With a pry bar pressing on the upper linkage, I can shift it a little, but this is going to take forever to remove. Around the other side, I can access the bolt face straight on with a socket and hold the spanner on the nut. I thought the handy Duca gun would bust this off, but the big Duca gun made an appearance and makes short work of it. By adjusting the jack slightly, I can ease tension on the bracket and knock it out. With that done, I can access the lower shock fastener easily. There is some weight on the shock, so with a touch more adjustment, the bolt comes right out. Quick cleanup and lower the hoist. The Duca gun busts the top fastener off no problem. Now I can remove the shock. Clearance is still a little tight, but I worked out that by rotating the shock, I can kind of thread it out with the coil springs. So old shock versus new shock. Other than the aesthetic choices, the first most obvious difference is the spring. The Hyperpro spring is shorter but slightly larger diameter coils, but I don't have any paperwork on exact spring rate specs. The advantage of having a shorter spring is that you can adjust that preload far more precisely, as well as a larger range of adjustability. Secondly, the shorter spring compresses and rebounds quicker, which helps keep the rear wheel pressing on the road. The new shock is the same length, so the ride height will be unchanged. Down the bottom of the shock is the rebound adjustment knob. Clockwise dampens, rebound, and counterclockwise increases it. Getting the new shock in the chassis was noticeably more difficult than removing the stock. The slightly wider spring required some patient maneuvering to get it back in the mounting position. I would end up removing the second dog bone bracket on the lower linkage to let it swing freely, giving me more clearance. With the top fastener fitted loose, I'm going to fit the lower linkage, as I may need the shock to move to get it back together. Lock tight to keep the nuts on and grease on the shaft to lubricate and prevent rust. Putting the lower linkage back together is basically the reverse of disassembly and not much to it. For your information, using a ratchet on the other end of the Duca gun is not a good idea. Now all that's left is the shock fasteners themselves. I probably should have done this one up before I put the dog bone back on. Yep, feels good, mate. Every biker knows that this is the most important part of any suspension upgrade. For the front end, I'll throw the bike up backwards. Again, I'm happy to use the flat jack on the pipes. For access, I need to remove the brakes, fender and wheels, which leaves the forks exposed. With everything apart, I like to check steering bearings and assess the tools I'll need for this bike. First step is to drain the fork oil. I recommend using a Duca gun to get these drain bolts out because the internal fork components can spin with the bolt. The quick speed and high torque is enough to overcome most of the time. These forks are a conventional design and fairly easy to service. Pumping the lower legs forces the oil out of the drain holes quicker and also makes a mess. The tiny pry bar gets the dust seals and retaining clip out. And now the lower leg is free to remove. Making sure I don't loose the lock nut. Again, the tiny pry bar is used to remove the bushings. Generally, I would not always completely dismantle the forks on this, but as we will be changing the oil viscosity and I want to guarantee my work, I'm going to renew the seals and clean as much of the oil and gunk that collects. Now I can start to reassemble the forks. I use electrical tape to protect the new seals as they slide on. I also coat them in fork oil to lubricate them. Spacer and bushings go back on. A dab of grease on the lock nut is a good way to stick it to the dampening rod. Then the lower leg goes on and the drain plug done up with a new sealing washer. Quick clean up and then I'll remove the forks. Now I can drive the new seals in and remove the top cap. Dual rate springs have two coil weights that work in conjunction with each other as the forks compress. Like before, the smaller coil reacts quicker to the more subtle loads, hence why it is positioned at the bottom of the fork. The larger coil carries a higher load and is responsible for the larger loads that applied to keep the bike floating for the most part. Just confirming the springs still bounce. Duca gun loosens the caps, then taken off with the ratchet. There is some slight spring load in these forks, but not that much. Winding off the preload on the caps almost eliminates any danger. Now I can remove the spring. The spring coil rates are significantly different. Hyperpro makes them to suit the rider's weight and application. The new setup requires a heavier weight oil and different oil level that is measured without the spring. This was all specified in the kit from Hyperpro. Pumping the fork legs forces oil into all the valves and galleries so the correct oil level is read. Double checking with a ruler. And now the fork is ready for the new spring. The spacers do not have to be modified in this setup. On this bike, both forks have identical internal components, so it's basically a repeat process for the other side. Another quick cleanup, and then I can start to reassemble the bike. If you have a keen eye, you might have noticed that the front wheel is fitted backwards. I would realize this and correct it off camera, but let me know in the comments if you notice this. And now for the important bit. Nailed it. If you live in the Sydney area, come check out our shop, Zen Motorcycles. We do this kind of thing and so much more. Well, that's how you fit a Hyperpro suspension upgrade to an SV650. I won't comment on the ride quality as I would need to do some long-term testing. But on the short road test I took, there was a definite improvement in the front-end dive. Generally, new springs require some bedding in before setting sag, so the client will return for us to set that up with him. Let me know what you thought in the comments. If you like this kind of content, like, subscribe and ring that bell. Ride safe and keep going.